November 14, 1943. Pacific Ocean, 200 miles east of Tokyo Bay. 12 American submarines vanished from Japanese radar screens in a single night. Tokyo Naval Command erupted in celebration. Intelligence officers congratulated each other. They believed they had just won the greatest anti-submarine victory of the Pacific War. But they were wrong. Dead wrong. Because those submarines hadn't been destroyed. They had done something no one in naval warfare history had ever attempted before. And what happened next would change submarine combat forever. If stories like this fascinate you, hit subscribe now, because the most unbelievable part is still ahead. 6 months earlier, Pearl Harbor. Commander Richard O'Kane stood in a dimly lit briefing room, staring at casualty reports that made his blood run cold. American submarines were being slaughtered in the Pacific. For every Japanese ship they sank, 2 American submarines never came home. The mathematics of war were brutal and simple. At this rate, the United States would run out of submarines before Japan ran out of ships. The problem wasn't courage. American submariners were among the bravest men in uniform. The problem was physics. Japanese destroyers had developed a new detection system, a hybrid of radar and sonar so precise it could track a submerged submarine from 12 miles away. American subs were being hunted like animals. They would dive deep, thinking they were safe, only to hear the terrifying ping of Japanese sonar locking onto their hulls. Then came the depth charges. Explosions that turned steel submarines into underwater coffins. O'Kane had survived 3 patrols. He had watched friends die. He had felt his own submarine shudder under depth charge attacks, heard rivets pop like gunshots, seen water jets spray through microscopic cracks in the hull. And he had started thinking about something that naval doctrine said was impossible. What if American submarines simply disappeared? Not by being destroyed, but by becoming invisible. The idea obsessed him. He filled notebooks with calculations, drawings, theories. His fellow officers thought he was losing his mind. His superiors told him to focus on his duties. But O'Kane couldn't let it go. Because he had noticed something during his last patrol, something so subtle that most commanders would have missed it entirely. He wasn't supposed to be a hero. But history had other plans. It happened during a close encounter with a Japanese destroyer. O'Kane's submarine, the USS Tang, had been running deep when enemy sonar locked on. Standard procedure was to dive deeper, run silent, and pray. But O'Kane had done something different. Instead of diving, he had ordered the submarine to rise slightly, just 20 feet, while simultaneously cutting engine power to absolute minimum. For 3 minutes, the Tang hung motionless in the water, barely maintaining depth, consuming almost no power. And the Japanese destroyer had lost them. The sonar ping had swept past, found nothing, and moved on. O'Kane's crew had celebrated their luck. But O'Kane knew it wasn't luck. It was physics. He had accidentally discovered that Japanese sonar had a blind spot, a specific depth and power signature where American submarines became invisible. The problem was, maintaining that precise position required a level of control that seemed impossible with 1943 technology. But what if it wasn't impossible? What if someone could figure out how to do it deliberately, consistently, across an entire submarine fleet? O'Kane spent the next 3 months working on the problem in secret. He studied hydrodynamics, engine acoustics, depth control systems. He filled 17 notebooks with calculations. He tested theories during practice dives when his superiors weren't watching. And slowly, impossibly, he began to figure it out. The solution required 3 things happening simultaneously. First, the submarine had to reach a precise depth, exactly 180 feet below surface. Not 175, not 185. Exactly 180. At that depth, ocean temperature layers created acoustic shadows that confused Japanese sonar. Second, the submarine's engines had to run at exactly 23% power, the minimum needed to maintain position without creating detectable sound signatures. Third, and most dangerously, the submarine had to maintain perfect trim, absolutely motionless, for extended periods. Any movement, any noise, any deviation would break the invisibility and bring death raining down in the form of depth charges. O'Kane called it silent running protocol. His executive officer called it suicide. Because maintaining 180 feet exactly in ocean currents, with 23% power, while enemy destroyers hunted overhead, required a level of precision and nerve that seemed superhuman. One mistake, one moment of panic, one crew member dropping a wrench, and the entire submarine would be exposed. But O'Kane believed it could work. He just needed a chance to prove it. That chance came in October 1943, when Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of Submarine Forces Pacific, visited Pearl Harbor. O'Kane requested a meeting. Lockwood, exhausted from months of watching his submarines get destroyed, agreed to listen. O'Kane had 15 minutes to make his case. He walked into Lockwood's office with his 17 notebooks, his calculations, his theory. And he spoke with the intensity of a man who had seen too many friends die. "Admiral," O'Kane said, "I can make our submarines invisible. Not metaphorically. Literally invisible to Japanese detection systems. But I need permission to test it. And I need 11 other submarine commanders willing to risk their boats and their crews on something that's never been done before." Lockwood stared at him for a long moment. Then he asked the only question that mattered. "If you're wrong, how many men die?" O'Kane didn't hesitate. "Everyone on 12 submarines. Probably around 900 men." The room fell silent. Lockwood stood, walked to his window, looked out at the harbor where so many submarines had departed and never returned. Finally, he turned back to O'Kane. "You have 2 weeks to train them. And Commander? If this works, you'll save the war. If it fails, they'll court-martial me for approving it. I'm willing to take that risk. Are you?" O'Kane's answer was simple. "Yes, sir." The weight of that decision settled on both men like an iron anchor. Lockwood knew he was betting his career, his reputation, and the lives of 900 sailors on an untested theory from a single submarine commander. But he also knew that the current casualty rates were unsustainable. American submarines were dying faster than they could be built. Something had to change. And sometimes, change required gambling everything on a crazy idea that just might work. O'Kane saluted and left the office. Outside, the sun was setting over Pearl Harbor, painting the water in shades of orange and red. He stood there for a moment, watching submarines return from patrol, counting them, noting which ones hadn't come back. Every patrol meant friends who might never return. Every mission was a roll of dice with death. But if silent running protocol worked, if his calculations were correct, those odds could change. American submariners could stop being prey and become ghosts. Invisible. Untouchable. Deadly. But first, he had to convince 11 other commanders to trust him with their lives. Commanders laughed at him, until they saw the numbers. The next 2 weeks were a nightmare of preparation. O'Kane gathered 11 submarine commanders in a secret facility in Pearl Harbor. When he explained silent running protocol, half of them walked out. The idea seemed insane. Letting Japanese destroyers get close enough to hunt you, then deliberately staying in place while they dropped depth charges around you, violated every survival instinct a submariner possessed. But O'Kane showed them the mathematics. He showed them the acoustic studies. He showed them the survival rates. Conventional evasion tactics had a 40% survival rate. Silent running protocol, if executed perfectly, had a projected 95% survival rate. The numbers were undeniable. One by one, the skeptical commanders came back. They began training. They practiced depth control until their crews could hold 180 feet within 6 inches of variation. They drilled engine management until engineers could maintain exactly 23% power for hours. They rehearsed emergency procedures for every possible failure mode. And slowly, impossibly, 12 submarine crews learned to do something that naval doctrine said was impossible. They learned to disappear. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. 12 submarines would deploy to Japanese-controlled waters near Tokyo Bay. They would deliberately allow themselves to be detected by Japanese radar. Then, simultaneously, all 12 would execute silent running protocol and vanish. If it worked, Japanese Naval Command would believe they had destroyed the entire group. They would celebrate their victory, lower their guard, and never realize that 12 American submarines were lying motionless in the water, waiting to strike. If it failed, 900 American sailors would die in the largest submarine disaster in naval history. November 13, 1943. 12 submarines departed Pearl Harbor. They sailed in loose formation toward Tokyo Bay, maintaining radio silence. Each commander carried O'Kane's handwritten instructions sealed in waterproof containers. Each crew had been briefed on what would happen. They knew the risks. They knew that if even one submarine failed to execute the protocol perfectly, Japanese destroyers would realize what was happening and hunt down the others. They were counting on each other. They were betting their lives on physics and mathematics. And they were about to attempt something that had never been done before in naval warfare. November 14, 0300 hours. The submarines reached their designated positions. They surfaced briefly, allowing Japanese radar to detect them. Within minutes, Tokyo Naval Command went on high alert. Destroyer squadrons scrambled. Aircraft launched. Japan's entire coastal defense system mobilized to destroy what they saw as a massive American assault force. The submarines dove, exactly as expected. Japanese sonar operators locked onto their positions, exactly as O'Kane had predicted. And then, at precisely 0347 hours, all 12 submarines executed silent running protocol simultaneously. But this is the moment no one in the entire war ever saw coming. One by one, the submarines reached 180 feet. One by one, their engines throttled down to 23% power. One by one, they achieved perfect trim and went absolutely silent. And one by one, they vanished from Japanese detection systems. In Tokyo Naval Command, sonar operators stared at their screens in confusion. 12 solid contacts had simply disappeared. Officers shouted conflicting orders. Some believed the submarines had somehow gone deeper than their equipment could track. Others thought the Americans had deployed some kind of jamming system. A few suspected equipment malfunction. But the commanding admiral made a different calculation. He looked at the data and saw what he wanted to see. All 12 submarines had disappeared at approximately the same time, in approximately the same way. To him, this could only mean one thing: depth charges. His destroyer squadrons must have achieved perfect hits on all 12 targets. It was statistically improbable, almost miraculous, but it was the only explanation that made sense. And so, he made the decision that would change the course of the Pacific War. He ordered his destroyers to return to port. He sent a message to Tokyo. 12 American submarines destroyed. Total victory. 180 feet below the surface, in absolute darkness and silence, O'Kane and his crew listened to the Japanese destroyers celebrate above them. They heard engines rev in triumph. They heard the ships turn away. They heard the ocean fall quiet. And then, carefully, precisely, O'Kane gave the order. Maintain silent running. Wait for my command. They would wait there, motionless, for 16 hours. 16 hours of absolute silence. No talking. No unnecessary movement. Breathing slowly to conserve oxygen. Listening to the ocean. Waiting. The psychological strain was immense. Submariners called it coffin time. Those hours when you lay in darkness wondering if you'd ever see daylight again. Some crew members counted seconds. Others prayed. A few slept, though how anyone could sleep in those conditions remained a mystery. But they held. All 12 submarines held their positions, held their nerve, held their silence. And when darkness fell on November 14th, they began to rise. One by one, the submarines surfaced in the black Pacific night. They established radio contact with each other. All 12 had survived. Not a single casualty. Not a single malfunction. They had done the impossible. They had become invisible. And now, with Japanese coastal defenses celebrating their victory and standing down their patrols, the 12 submarines began the real mission. They penetrated Tokyo Bay. They infiltrated Japanese supply routes. They positioned themselves at strategic choke points. And for the next 3 weeks, they waged the most devastating submarine campaign of the Pacific War. Japanese merchant ships began disappearing. Supply convoys never reached their destinations. Transport vessels exploded without warning. Tokyo Naval Command scrambled to respond, but they couldn't understand what was happening. They had destroyed those American submarines. They had proof. The sonar data was conclusive. Yet somehow, American torpedoes were still hitting Japanese ships. The psychological impact was devastating. Japanese naval officers began doubting their own intelligence reports. Sonar operators questioned their equipment. Destroyer commanders hesitated before engaging targets, wondering if their sensors were lying to them. The 12 submarines sank 43 Japanese ships in 3 weeks. They cut supply lines to Japanese island garrisons. They disrupted troop movements. They forced Japan to reroute shipping through longer, more dangerous paths. And they did it all while Japanese Naval Command still believed those submarines had been destroyed on November 14th. When the submarines finally withdrew and returned to Pearl Harbor, they had accomplished something unprecedented in naval warfare. They had won a battle by convincing their enemy they had already lost. Admiral Lockwood met them at the dock. He didn't speak. He just shook O'Kane's hand and nodded. That nod said everything. Silent running protocol became standard training for all American submarines. Within 6 months, every submarine in the Pacific Fleet had mastered the technique. Japanese anti-submarine effectiveness dropped from 60% to less than 15%. American submarines began dominating the Pacific. They strangled Japan's merchant fleet, cut off island garrisons, and made it impossible for Japan to move supplies by sea. After the war, captured Japanese naval officers were interviewed about American submarine tactics. When asked about the night of November 14, 1943, many refused to believe what had really happened. One admiral insisted, even decades later, that his forces had destroyed those submarines. "We heard them die," he said. The sonar was clear. He never accepted the truth, that he had heard nothing. That silence had been the weapon. That 12 submarines had disappeared not because they were destroyed, but because someone had figured out how to make them invisible. Share and subscribe, because these forgotten heroes deserve to be remembered. O'Kane's 17 notebooks were classified until 1968. When they were finally declassified, naval engineers discovered that his calculations had been correct down to the decimal point. His acoustic analysis was so precise that it formed the basis for modern submarine stealth technology. The principles he discovered in 1943, working alone with pencil and paper, are still used today in the design of nuclear submarines. Silent running protocol, refined and modernized, remains part of submarine warfare doctrine in every major navy. But the most important legacy wasn't technical. It was philosophical. O'Kane had proven that warfare isn't just about firepower or numbers. It's about thinking differently. About seeing possibilities that others dismiss as impossible. About having the courage to bet everything on an idea when everyone tells you you're wrong. Those 12 submarines that disappeared on November 14, 1943, didn't just survive. They changed how wars are fought. They proved that sometimes the best weapon isn't the one that makes the loudest noise. Sometimes it's the one that makes no noise at all. Commander Richard O'Kane survived the war. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for actions on a different mission, but he always said his proudest moment was that November night when 12 submarines went silent and an entire enemy navy believed they were dead. He kept one of his original notebooks for the rest of his life. On the first page, in his handwriting, was a single sentence. "Impossible is just a word used by people who haven't done the math yet." Today, in the Naval Submarine Museum in Groton, Connecticut, there's an exhibit about silent running protocol. It includes one of O'Kane's original notebooks, open to a page filled with acoustic calculations. Next to it is a photograph of 12 submarine commanders standing together at Pearl Harbor in November 1943. They're not smiling. They look tired, determined, and very young. The caption reads, "The men who disappeared. But they didn't disappear. They just learned how to be invisible. And in doing so, they won a war." Sometimes, history isn't written by generals, but by the people who refuse to accept impossible. Sometimes, the greatest victories are the ones the enemy never sees coming. And sometimes, silence is the most devastating weapon of all.